Hello, and welcome to this SEO Mastery Summit, Day 6 Q&A. And it's been another fantastic day with lots of amazing speakers, and as always, lots and lots of good feedback. Today here in the live stream, I am going to cover quite a few questions we've had sort of about staffing and outsourcing and so on. We had people like Liam today talking a lot about how to scale up and how to build a team and so on. And we've had quite a few questions around that topic. So I'm gonna go through some of those and give you some great answers. So first and foremost, the first question we have, and that's totally relevant to that, is specifically when you're scaling up a team and starting to hiring staff for the first time, what are the key things to look for? So it's a big question, lots of potential answers, but when you're hiring your first couple of staff members, a couple of pieces of key advice for me is number one, look much more for sort of cultural fit, looks much more for attitude, mentality. Really make sure that it's a human being that you would be very comfortable spending a lot of time with, right? It is very, very easy to be blown away by resumes and CVs and so on. That looks like a lot of experience and all this good stuff. And one of the key problems that people make is they actually just look at a resume, and when they get to the interview, they've already made up their mind and they're kind of like, yeah, I'm totally going to hire that person, right? But really, you want to put yourself in a situation where your focus is much more on the sort of soft skill, right? Particularly when you're hiring your first staff, and particularly as a small business, you really want to get people on board that sticks around, right? And everything else being equal, you are more likely to have some, let's call it rougher diamonds that sticks around when you're hiring them in the beginning, particularly if you're not amazingly great at people management, right? Because when you give people an opportunity, when you give them a chance, they tend to be grateful as long as you're half decent with them, right? Whereas when you're hiring top performers or people that are extremely good, they are typically expecting things to flow, right? They're expecting like things to be relatively easy and so on and so forth, right? So again, depending on the role, there's obviously always some variation, but that's generally my recommendation, right? Now, what I would say as well, lots and lots of people focus a lot on salaries, and it's always like, oh yeah, I want to find some cheap labor I can pay a couple of dollars an hour and so on. And the thing is, that can work, right? But like money talks to a certain extent, right? So again, if you look at it as a curve, right? If you pay very little, you can still find great people in any country you're in, right? Like if you're hiring in the US, right? If you're in a place where minimum salary is $10 an hour, you can pay $10 an hour and you can find someone decent, right? However, it definitely takes you significantly longer, everything else being equal, right? Because when you're looking at costs, when you're looking at salaries, what tend to happen is that you will find lots of people with some experience and some skill set that are pricing themselves at a higher rate. And then typically I don't necessarily recommend paying top dollar, right? Like if you're grown and scaled at an amazingly big company with very high profit margins, you can probably go and pay top dollar for some guys and be in a very good place, right? And it can make total sense. But particularly with your first couple of hires, again, right? Like you really want to make sure that first of all the fits are there in terms of culture. I mean, personally, just to bring out some examples. So a couple of the things that I always look for is first of all trust, right? So the thing is, if anyone during the interview process does anything that tells me that I can't trust them, that is a huge red flag. Now, I am typically relatively naive as a human being, and I tend to trust people until they give me a reason not to. But particularly in an interview situation, I tend to very much look for people who answer very honestly, to questions, right? So we like having sort of 2 or 3 questions around honesty specifically. And a couple of simple ones would be, what do you prefer? What's your preference if you have to pick one or the other? Do you prefer working by yourself or as part of a team, right? And that's, you can have a few questions like those, but questions that sort of ask them to take a stance, and it gives them the opportunity to pick either or. Now, what happens is with most people, they'll say, well, I'm very good at both. I can work with myself and I can work in a team. And that's the political answer, right? What we found after interviewing, I've interviewed thousands of people, right? So a question like that, the best people, when we've looked at our top 10% of our performers in the companies that I run, what we found is those 10% in 9 out of 10 cases give a very straight answer, right? They don't bullshit around and be like, yeah, I'm great at both, but they'll say, I work much better alone. When I can sit down, concentrate, and just get stuff done, stuff moves. Or they'll say the other, like, I work in a team, and I love being surrounded by people. It's great for my inspiration when there's other people around that I can talk about things with, and so on. And honestly, the answer here is not so important, but what we definitely found, with at least looking at our absolute top performers, was that when people gave a straight answer to what they would prefer, they were not afraid to be honest, right? So they weren't trying to give a political answer to sort of, well, if you look for this answer or that answer, I cover both. But that was what we were very much looking for, right? What we've been doing a lot as well is also questions. And this is in typical interviewing, questions about weakness have often been taken out, right? It's seen like an old-fashioned example and so on. But we actually do that for the same reason. So one of the questions we love asking is around, what generally as a personality, so not your skills, but from a personality standpoint, what's your weakness, right? And the main reason we love asking that question in our interview process is the fact that it gives people, again, an opportunity to be open, right? And again, like, some of the best staff I've hired have been very honest. Like, I interviewed a woman at one point, and she was like, sometimes I get really angry, and when it happens, I know I need to go to the bathroom. I need to sit there for 5-10 minutes, and I need to calm down. It doesn't happen often, but when it happens, I have to do it, right? And this was someone that was willing to be honest about a weakness or about something around their own character that they were facing, and they were willing to share that, right? Now, she had obviously worked at it for a while and already found a solution. But again, generally, our experience was that when people are willing to share that, when people are actually willing to tell you that, particularly in a sort of first or second time interview, and that is something that, again, particularly in the honesty and sort of trust column, really works well, right? Now, again, the reason why we have come up with the different questions that we are working with is really because, again, when we've hired people, what we do is we spend a lot of time looking back at the people at work and the people that doesn't work. So one of the scenarios on the opposite end was we did some interviews, and we found that we had a lot of candidates from a particular university absolutely never work out. So we looked at, we're consistently looking at all our staff. We're looking typically at our best performers and our worst performers and seeing what do they have in common, right? When we hired in the Philippines in my outsourcing business, what we found was that anyone that have lived abroad, literally lived abroad, not just been on a 1-week holiday, but if they've lived abroad even a couple of months, like, that basically give them something that just make them significantly better. Obviously, that alone doesn't make you a great employee. But again, what we found was when we were looking at our sort of top 10 employees in the business, basically like 8 of those had all lived abroad, right? And this was not one of these discoveries that you only really see when you hire at scale, and it's not something that's so easy to see initially. But the whole point of this and the whole concept is that you really want to look at what are your, and when you're hiring in the beginning, your company values is your values, right? And you really want to look at what are the key things that you value, right? If it's, showing up on time every single day, then you need to look for people who do that, right? Because what you want to do, your first 3, 4, 5 employees, they're effectively going to form the culture of your business, right? And you really want to make sure that you get the right people on board and you really reinforce that culture, right? People, like if you have someone, let's say someone straight out of college that you hire, what they do is and they don't do this consciously, it happens subconsciously, right? But they look around when they come into a business and they follow the norms. So if they look around and they see the first 2 or 3 days they arrive, everyone comes into the office 5, 10 minutes late. On day 4, they will do the same, or day 5 or day 7 or whatever, right? The whole point is that they won't see it as an issue because it looks like everyone does it, right? And like in a lot of companies, when obviously the more work experience people have, the more they tend to be set in their ways and the harder it is often to change them. But particularly newer employees and people who haven't had that many jobs, that many years job experience, they're very, very easy to influence. And therefore, it's a great time to really make sure that you set the account straight. One of the things that we have found is a big game changer is when you hire new staff. Most of the time, a lot of people don't really care what hours they work. They're often like, yeah, you just work whenever you want and just work your hours and so on. And that the mindset behind that is great. However, when you're dealing with a new employee, one key thing is always true is it's easier to become nicer or to make the requirements less than it is to go the other way. So what we have found is typically that if you set like a standard working hours even for the first month, and make sure like when the person is working and you can check in and follow up during that time. Again, you are more likely to get a successful candidate output after the first couple of months, right? And the way we tend to do it is really when we hire, like, and sometimes people will have certain shift based on what they're doing and so on. But even people where what time of day they work doesn't matter, we would actually still give them a shift. And we would do this just to make sure that we know when they're supposed to be working. We can see like what is their dedication and so on. And then over time, when they've been on board for a while, then we tend to relax on things if they're doing what we expect them to do, if they're performing well, right? And the problem is you can't really go the other way. So if you start with someone and you tell them, work whenever, and if you're seeing performance problems and you feel it's because they're not necessarily working the full hours, it's not about working the hours per se. You're looking as an employer, you're looking for the output, right? So when you employ someone, what you want is not just 40 hours, but you're looking for them to do something. And it's very important not just to get stuck on the time, but it's very, very important to focus on the output, right? And here's the thing, like we've had people, trying to work at like 3 a.m. in the morning, or, working like 16 hours on a Saturday or a Sunday to try and make up time for the week and so on. And the problem is, in most cases, you're not getting great work like that, right? So the challenge you will have is many people occasionally take that freedom too simple, right? Or they take it too literal, and they aren't focused on what do I need to deliver for the company, but they're focused on, I work my 40 hours, right? This is also one of the reasons why like using time tracking tools can be fantastic, right? You can get a lot of information from it, particularly if you run an agency or any kind of SaaS services or the likes. You really want to have time tracking so you know how much time is going into what stuff, right? But fundamentally, the main problem with time tracking is not time tracking itself. it's mostly the way it's being used by employers, right? Like employers sitting around and be like, I want to make sure I get my 40 hours worth of work, right? And the problem is fundamentally that is the wrong mindset, right? Because when you're consistently focusing just on the output, on the time instead of the output, I mean, anyone can sit down in a chair and sit in front of a screen for 40 hours, but if it's not giving you the output you need, that doesn't help you, right? So in my opinion, the first sort of core goal always need to be set at what is the expected output. And really, you want to use time tracking, if you do use it, as a secondary, much more like a understanding where the time goes, right? Like understanding where we're spending our time, and understanding, being able to sit down with the employee and see, well, where's the time being spent, right? Is it being spent in the right place? And say, oh, I gave you this project. I thought it would take, 5 hours, but I see you spent 50 hours on it, right? So that's where time tracking can make sense. And you can then like better get alignment and so on, right? So that's a good bit around time tracking as well. The last thing, when you're hiring people for the first time, right? Most of the time you haven't done interviews before, you haven't recruited before. And it's very, very challenging to set a baseline. So one of the key things that I recommend is, first of all, hiring is the single most important skill you can probably learn as a business owner, right? Like hiring the right people makes your life so much easier. And investing some time and effort into improving this makes a lot of sense. Now, the problem is the first person you ever interview, you have absolutely nothing to benchmark against. You can say, oh, this person sounds great, or they don't sound great. But when you haven't interviewed other people, reality is you have no idea. So actually, my recommendation for the first time you're interviewing is go through and actually do a fair chunk of interviews, and 5 or 10 at a minimum, I really recommend for your first time around. Now, I also think it's generally a good idea to maybe find someone in your network, or find a friend or something who have maybe done it before, who can actually do the interviews with you, right? Because there's so many subtle things that you don't think about and so on when you haven't interviewed before. And really sitting down and spending some time investing into this process will generally give you significantly a better output. And the whole thing is like, honestly, even if all the people are crap, if you interview 10 people, you at least have a baseline. Like you can measure them against each other, right? The problem is I see so many people that interview 1 or 2 staff or potential staff, and then they go make the hire, right? And they're in there straight away. And it makes sense because they want to plug a hole, right? They're like, oh, I'm so busy, I need to get this done, right? But honestly, unless again you know someone who's already great, right? Like having a good network. If you're one of those people that have a big network, you know lots of people, and you already know someone you feel is perfect to fill the role, that can definitely work as well, right? But if you're going out to interview people you've never met before, you generally want to get a baseline. You generally want to get a touch for, interviewing and so on. And very, very importantly, ask people the same questions, right? So obviously you can have some very individual specific question to people's career and things like that. But I've seen a lot of people starting interviewing where basically, they literally end up asking candidates totally different questions. Sometimes they haven't prepared and they just ask them whatever is the top of their head. But the problem is if you ask candidates specific questions, it becomes so much more difficult to compare them. And really what you're doing in an interview is comparing, right? And the last little hint here, if you're interviewing people and you don't think any of them is going to be good enough, don't hire. And if you listen to this, that will potentially save you a lot of money, right? Because when you're hiring, particularly in the beginning, it's so easy to say, I need a staff member. I interviewed X amount of people. I picked the best one. And that makes sense. However, if you're not comfortable that the best one can do the job well, you want to go through the recruitment and the interviewing and the hiring process again. You don't want to hire someone you're not confident in, right? So that was a little bit about that. Now, the second question we have is very much around outsourcing. And again, full disclosure, we do own a big outsourcing company called Outsourcing. And again, people always come to me and they're like, yeah, I want to outsource. And that's great. Key thing, so three angles I look at a business. You want to know what you own. So you want to know, as a business, what are the things that you master really, really, really well, right? And the reason why you want to know that is because you want to generally keep a very tight leash on that. So you want to keep that in-house. So like if you're doing SEO, and let's say you're an amazing on-page person, or you have amazing on-page processes and the like, right? You're like, that's what we want to own. We want to do that in-house. Now, outsourcing can be understood in a few different ways, right? Some people's like, oh, well, when I hire someone in Asia, I'm outsourcing, and if I hire someone locally, I'm hiring locally, and that's not really a great definition, right? So generally, outsourcing is when you really hand over the responsibility of tasks and so on to a different business. And when you're hiring employees in-house, they're employees, right? It doesn't really matter if you call them VAs or whatever. The point is, if they work for you, if 40 hours of their week goes to your business, they effectively work for you, right? And that's fundamentally, that's not really outsourcing per se, right? But let's say you realize that on-page is your thing. That's what you're amazing at, and that's where you bring in the most value. You then want to look at the other aspects and say, what are the things that we can either buy as services or, get done well elsewhere, right? Because the problem with most people is they try and do it all. And as an individual, like, if you run one site, like doing on-page, doing content writing, doing link building, like doing all that it's more than a mouthful. And the likelihood that you're going to be amazing at all of it is very slim, right? So fundamentally, particularly as a smaller business, what you really want to do is you want to say, this is our focus. So we do on-page really, really well, right? Now, we have a secondary supplier who helps us with content, and we might have a supplier, we might have an outsourcing building somewhere else. But on-page, that's where we focus, right? Now, if you look at the most successful agencies out there, that is the type of approach they take. Right, so they really, and also big in the in-house businesses and so on. It's about understanding what do you need to own and what is not critical for you to own, right? So really going through that process and really thinking through and saying, what makes the most sense for me here. And then when you've gone through that process and you're then saying, well, we want to own in-house, we want to own on-page. Then you can start looking and saying, what are the people we need to bring in? And again, I am a little bit biased owning an outsourcing company, but fundamentally, you shouldn't hire people in lower cost locations for any reason, right? So there's plenty of jobs where I recommend using native people. So a lot of sales, for example, tend to be much better done with native people. General content writing often is better done by native English speakers, as an example. Really, the way I like to look at the world is, the world is small nowadays, and there's various parts of the world that I personally like using for various kind of hires, right? So for sort of simple process execution, for stuff that doesn't require amazing language skills, and let's say that could be for, like, let's say one of the things you own in-house is link building because you're amazing at it, right? Like there's a lot of pieces of the link building process that can actually be executed relatively cheaply, right? Where you can have people sit and verify email addresses, or like depending again on your process and so on, right? But there's many parts that can often be really done at a low cost level, right? And it makes total sense to do that because if you hire someone for $3 an hour, or you hire someone for $10 an hour, you're not necessarily going to get anywhere near 3% more productivity out of it, right? And really the fundamental, when you hire people, it's not really so much what they cost. The question is always about the return on the investment, right? So if you hire a guy, pay him 10 grand a month and he makes you 100K, that's good, right? If you hire someone and pay them a grand and they make you 2 grand, that's still good, but it's less good, right? So fundamentally, we always try and sit down and understand, where in sort of the pay scale does different tasks belong, and where do they make the most sense, right? Because it's easy trying to hire very low cost people to do high cost work. So you could definitely go and see if you can find someone for $3 an hour that can turn into be an amazing SEO expert. And that's, over time particularly, that's not impossible, right? You can teach people a lot. However, the likelihood is that the chance of failure is significantly higher generally, right? And you really want to stack the odds. So again, you need to look at your business as well. What's your profit margins, depending on the business model you're running. If you have very low profit margins, you are likely in a situation where, at least initially, you need to hire cheaper cost. If you're in a very high cost, high margin business, you can often afford to pay a little bit more for better staff initially. But really, for me, it's about looking at what is it you need, what level do you need them at, and how can you really figure out in your business, like, what do you hire for various roles, right? And again, I know plenty of companies that have been super successful at just hiring Filipino people, for example. My good friend Kurt at Convertica have a team that's run primarily by Filipinos, and they're doing absolutely amazing, as an example, right? There's also people who do a good mix, and we're definitely amongst those. So we have definitely a majority of Filipino employees in my businesses overall. But for example, when I hire developers, I love going to Eastern Europe, and Ukraine in particular have always been very, very good to us in terms of sort of hardcore developers and so on, right? When I look, so basically, like, different areas kind of have different skill sets and so on. And depending on what you need, that's one of the things you learn over time, but lots and lots of opportunities to hire different kinds of people, right? I generally, again, having lots of Filipinos, they're generally great for process execution, customer service, and so on. Definitely lots and lots of skill sets, right? And it's like they come with a lot of that natural empathy. They come with a lot of that sort of ability to do repetitive tasks without necessarily being bored or finding it too cumbersome and so on. And that's some of the great things they're very, very good at doing, right? And again, like everyone, they can learn, and there's obviously always exceptions out there, right? But those are kind of the higher level stuff that we look at. That's sort of the mindset we really love to look at when we look at Philippines and so on, right? When we need more sort of critical thinking, we really like looking at Eastern Europe, right? And Eastern Europe is it's a good place as well to hire. You can typically find as well, maybe not as cheap, but also relatively cost-effective labor. So the key thing again is just make sure you balance up what is it you're trying to do, what does it make sense cost-wise, and what is it you need in those roles, right? So, and again, I really recommend that you ask in, the various SEO Facebook groups and so on you're in, what people have had success with, right? All the Facebook groups are filled up with all these SEO questions, but go in and ask. Like, some people do it occasionally. I've seen them recently around content writers and so on. There've been a lot more, but go in and say, I need someone to do on page. Like, where have you guys found most success hiring those kind of people? What are the critical skills you've looked for? What are so on and so forth, right? So get some feedback from other people who have been in the world of SEO and really see what are they doing and how can they get around it the best. Now, the next question is around probably Filipinos, I would say. So this guy's asking, you've had some bad experience generally hiring Filipinos, either people disappearing or they haven't been particularly effective. So again, when you start with a new employee, some of the key things are, number one, have enough work for them. If you hire someone and the first thing you do for the first week is like, yeah, here's a little bit to do that, and then just take your day off or whatever. The problem is, again, this is a cultural thing. You want to show people, here we work hard, and here we put in effort, and here we do get things done. The challenge is, and I've seen this happen so many times, is if you let people into a job and you make it like, oh, well, we only work an hour or two every day, people will slow down. They'll take longer because they want to stretch it out to take the full day, or they don't do that. Again, they don't do that consciously, but it happens very much consciously. If you have 3 hours to do something, it will take you 3 hours, and if you have 30 minutes to do it, it will take you 30 minutes, right? So making sure that you have plenty of work, and again, like ideally goals, right? So for example, if you hire someone for link building, right, like set some goals. That's like, first month your goal is to have X amount of links. Like make it aggressive goals, and ideally like have some steps. This is the minimum goal. If you have this goal, there's a little bonus waiting, and if you have this goal, there's a big bonus waiting, right? But that way you're incentivizing people to get moving faster already from day one, right? And it's really important. It's really one of the sort of biggest failures I see with people hiring. They're like, oh, well, it's cheap, you can just give them a little bit, and if there's nothing, they'll always be there. But as a human being, it slows you down, right? I've been in jobs myself where it haven't been super busy, and the times where I get the most done is when I'm under the most pressure. And the longer time you've been under pressure, the longer time you've built up sort of your, I call it work stamina, the better you perform, right? So you really want to build up people's work stamina. Now, again, you don't want to give them stuff to do that adds no value. So one of the things that I always recommend when you hire, particularly in the beginning, is that you have some of these, we call them forever tasks, but it's basically some of these things that can always be done and always add value. And they're typically around like lead gen, link building, keyword research, or something that's like, if there's nothing else on your plate, this is what you go do. And that's something that can be super helpful in the beginning, because what you don't want to be doing is you don't want to have a staff member and then constantly stressing around trying to give them stuff or trying to find stuff to give them, right? So you really want to make sure there's things for them to do at a consistent level. Now, when you're hiring people, wherever you're doing it yourself, to something like online jobs PH is great. Obviously, it takes a significant amount of time, right? Which is why a lot of people use outsourcing companies like ourselves. But there's also many other great companies out there. What I really, really recommend is 2 things. One, you want to have dedicated people. Sometimes now outsourcing companies, they kind of swap around, and you have Pete one day and Paul another day and whatever. And, that you never really build up training. You don't really build up the individual as part of your business, right? So I really recommend that you make sure that it's a company or an organization that provides full-time staff. The second thing is, I always recommend you do either an interview or at least sort of that extensive chat with the individual first, right? So again, someone might be a great person, they might be a great worker, but they might not be a great cultural fit or even personal fit with you. Like if you're sitting talking with a human being and you're kind of like, I don't really like the stuff coming out of their mouth, or I don't like the way they talk or something like that, then honestly you don't want to hire them, right? Like you don't have to, you don't want to look for people who are just like you, but at the same time, like you want to be very comfortable with people that work for you, right? You want to be comfortable having conversations with them and so on. So making sure you look at that aspect is very, very important, right? So excellent. The last question here around outsourcing and sort of staffing is when to let them go, right? So I had one question here saying, I've been downscaling my link building side of business, and I currently have 4 people I need to let go. I find it really hard because they've been with me. One of them have been with me for 2 years plus, and I'm not really sure how to do it. So, 2 things to this. So first, if you have to let people go, that's okay, right? A lot of the time, people hold on to staff within their business just because they don't want to let them go. And that is not a good business decision if you don't have an actual need for them, right? So you might have need elsewhere in your company where it makes sense to put someone and give them a different role and responsibility. That can make a lot of sense. But you want to make sure it's something you actually really need. Because here's the thing. If you don't, you end up just increasing your expenses quite significantly when that is not the expectation, right? Again, sometimes you have tons of profits and it doesn't touch you very much, but fundamentally, you really want to look at your business and you want to see, is there actually a real need elsewhere? Is there a need that will give me maybe a similar ROI or at least give me a very positive ROI in moving this person into that job, right? Because it is, particularly if you're not great with conflict, it's often easier to just keep paying people than actually letting them go, right? So you need to make sure that you always treat people, you always want to treat people well and fairly. And if you have to let people go, the number one thing is be honest and be upfront about it, right? Because too many people kind of beating around the bush. They'll either do a chat or they'll do a phone call, and they're like, "Hey, yeah, you're doing such a great work, and life is great, and oh, by the way, I need to fire you," right? And that's not the way to do it. Like the moment you have to fire someone, you want to tell them, right? And you want to be honest about it. You want to say, "Hey, our link building requirements have significantly changed. We no longer link a link building team, and therefore, unfortunately, I have to let you go." Right? Again, I'm super happy to give you a recommendation if they've been a good employee, and go through sort of the steps. But you want to do that, and you want to be upfront about it. And firing people at any point in your career is shit. It is, right? I mean, even when I've had not very good employees, or particularly when I work corporate, I sometimes took over some teams that have employees that need to be let go. It is never, ever a fun experience, and it never will be. But if you want to run a business, you need to be able and capable of doing that. And again, do it with love, right? It's not about screaming and shouting and how horrible they are and so on. Most people are great, right? And most people have great aspects to who they are. And that's why you hired them in the first place, right? Now, the challenge is they might not fit your particular role. You might not have a budget for them anymore, and so on and so forth. So again, treat them with the respect they deserve and be honest to them, be upfront, and be well direct, right? So that was sort of the questions around outsourcing and hiring today. Again, if you have other questions, definitely feel free to either comment on this video later on, or even post a question in the group or on the page, and always happy to follow up. So thank you very much for following today's live. It was great to see you, and I hope there was some useful tips and advice.